Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about one of the strategies that I like to use myself sometimes and that I use with a lot of my clients, and that is rotating conventional and sumo deadlifts, right? We rotate them. Just like you guys see me over here doing ME work, you're seeing me rotate. What I do even for conventional, I don't like to do a lot of heavy sumo pulling because I'm not as good at it. But as far as things like speed work goes or volume work, because some of my people don't do speed work, we do rep work. And one of the things that I like to oftentimes do for a lot of my lifters, not all of them, is to rotate sumo and conventional back and forth, like on the speed work or the rep work. So what you see me doing here is these are two separate weeks of me doing dynamic work against heavy bands, really heavy bands. In this case, 200 pounds of band tension, and I like to go more sometimes. Sumo one week, and conventional the next. And so the question becomes, why would we do this? And I think what we have to look at is not so much the fact that we are working different muscles, even though we are. We could argue the sumo deadlift puts less stress on the back, right? It works the back a little bit less shear stress, works more hip, right? Works more hip musculature as far as adductors go, right? As far as abductors go. Definitely adductors too. We could make the case that glutes and all of that and erectors, maybe even hamstrings, could possibly get worked just as hard, if not harder, on the conventional. Definitely the erectors do. And your low back tends to be more likely to be a limit. Whereas in sumo, it tends to be lower body limited. And to some extent, things like hip mobility. So what do we get from the rotating? Well, number one, we're getting a slightly different training stress, right? We're helping avoid overuse. We're helping potentially with hypertrophy because we're changing the movements. But when we think of things like inflammation and overuse, when we're doing relatively high volumes of training, things like stimulus to fatigue start to matter. Where we're building up inflammation as far as joints and tendons really starts to matter, right? Because this is what we run into. Volume generally has more hypertrophic potential, but it's harder and harder to recover from. So as volume goes up, recovery has to be matched in all aspects of your life, or you actually sometimes get less muscle growth. Right? It may not add anything, or you may get less. We start turning into junk volume and then potentially overreaching, overtraining. But when we're looking at individual things, if we're doing lots and lots of conventional pulling, what gets fatigued? Our back, our low back, our erectors. Now, can this be offset with restoration work, such as if we're doing banded good mornings for high reps, we have access to a reverse hyper, things like that? You bet that can help because we get blood flow to those areas. We can work on those areas. We can do a lot of traction work. That'll help. It'll help a lot. However, the question becomes, will it help enough? Will it help enough, particularly if we're taking the volumes way up? Now, in these workouts here, I was only doing 6 doubles, on the speed work. But what if I wanted to take that way up? What if I wanted to go to 10 doubles? Well, against the heavy bands, that does start to accrue a little bit of fatigue, right? But, we could argue that's a much better way to go because we are doing what? We're using recoverable work. But as far as the stress on the low back, it's much higher. The stress on the back is higher. So if we get into a period to where the low back is getting overly fatigued, what could we do? We could switch to sumo. Or we could preemptively do it. We could rotate it in 3-week waves, or we could do it every week, right? Especially for adapting quickly. Like everything's on point and we're getting fast adaptation. Changing it weekly might not be a bad thing. Why? Because we don't start detraining from anything for about 14 days, really. So if every 14 days we're still hitting the conventional pull for speed and the sumo pull, that works very, very well. 3-week waves work if we're just trying to maximize one, right? We're trying to maximize one and we're just worried about the buildup of overuse. That will completely avoid it too. We don't have to wait till that inflammation sets in. We don't have to do that. You can rotate it before it occurs. But if it occurs, that's a good time to change it. All right. So, what's the problem with doing sumo all the time? Well, the problem with sumo all the time, particularly if we're doing wide stance squatting too. In my case, I do really wide stance box squats. I do wide stance belt squats, right? Which again, there's a lot of benefits to. We want to do these things. They're good. They're very good. So in that case, our hips might be starting to get inflamed. Okay, our hips, the actual hip joints is what we'll start feeling sometimes. Well, what happens if the hip joints get inflamed? We got to take stuff in narrower. That means we probably need to pull the sumo and go conventional for a while. Okay, right? We might need to bring our footing in on things like the belt squats. These are things that we might need to work on. So then we go over to conventional pulling for a bit. We might go over to just for a short bit a slightly narrower stance on the squat, or even our box work. Or what about our supplemental work? Belt squats, leg presses, all these things, right? Because oftentimes we're doing these unless we're running a basic system just built around the barbell stuff, which I do program for some people. Not the best way to get the most training volumes in though. But all this other work, we may need to bring the stance in a little bit, but the pulling is going to be a big one. But that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, because what can we do here? We can change where the inflammation is. And if we're doing that, we can get away with more work. You can do way more pulls. If you're rotating them, you can get away with more pulling, because we're not building up as much overuse in those individual areas. We're generally worried about overuse in the low back on the conventional. We're worried about overuse in the hips on the sumo. But again, if we're rotating them, we can get more volumes because that overuse will dissipate quicker, because then we have weeks where we're not doing it. And we're not hitting those areas really with it at all. Puts us in a very good situation, doesn't it? Right, I think it does. I think particularly if we want to specialize in deadlifting and we want to do a lot of speed pulling volume, okay, which is not a bad approach if you're trying to specialize in the deadlift for a bit. Works pretty well. So again, rotating it allows us to do this. And then we also get the hypertrophy of the slightly novel training response, because again, the emphasis is different. I mean, the muscles worked are relatively similar, but there's definitely a difference between the two. And so by rotating it, again, the potential for more hypertrophy is there, just like rotating your barbell and your dumbbells, for your chest pressing or something. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.